Little morning sun made its way through the tall windows of the Oakwood County Courthouse as 16-year-old Marcus Johnson adjusted his borrowed navy blue tie. His mother Sarah had spent an hour getting everything just right. His white shirt pressed crisp, his black dress shoes polished to a shine, and his curly hair neatly trimmed the day before. They both had thought looking respectable would somehow help their case, but neither knew they were walking into a courtroom where appearances would not matter. Marcus stood straight, his hand trembling slightly as he faced Judge William Harrison. The judge's reputation preceded him in their small town of Millbrook. Though few dared to speak openly about his questionable sentencing patterns, at 62 years young, with steel gray hair and cold blue eyes, Judge Harrison looked down from his bench with an expression that made Marcus' stomach twist into knots. Case number 2019 JD 11458, State versus Marcus Johnson, the court clerk announced, her voice echoing through the hushed courtroom. The charges seemed ridiculous to everyone who knew Marcus. He was accused of stealing $500 worth of electronics from Wilson's convenience store on Oak Street, where the alleged theft had taken place on Tuesday, October 15th, between 4:30 and 5 p.m. precisely, when Marcus had been stocking shelves at the public library, his after-school job for the past year. Mrs. Wilson, the elderly librarian, sat in the courtroom's third row. She previously testified about Marcus' presence in the library, even showed the signed time sheet and security camera footage that clearly showed him working during the supposed theft. 5 other witnesses, including 2 honor roll students and a retired teacher, had confirmed seeing Marcus at the library at the time. The evidence in Marcus' favor was overwhelming. His public defender, Mr. Rodriguez, had presented a solid case, perfect alibi, spotless record, straight A student, active in community service, and a recommendation letter from the school principal. Even the convenience store's grainy security footage showed a suspect who was at least 5 inches shorter than Marcus. Your Honor, Mr. Rodriguez argued, standing with confidence, though we have clear evidence that Marcus Johnson could not have committed this crime. Multiple reliable witnesses, documented proof of his whereabouts, and security footage that does not match my client's physical description. Marcus is an honor student with a 4.0 GPA, volunteering weekly at the local food bank. Judge Harrison raised his hand, cutting off the defense attorney mid-sentence. I've heard enough, Mr. Rodriguez. His voice carried weight that silenced the courtroom. This court has seen many young men like Mr. Johnson, who belied their academic achievements, placed them above the law. Sarah Johnson gripped the wooden bench until her knuckles turned white. She watched as Judge Harrison shuffled some papers, not even bothering to look at the evidence photos spread before him. The security footage still played silently on the courtroom screen, showing a clearly different person committing the theft. Marcus Johnson. Judge Harrison's voice boomed through the courtroom. This court finds you guilty of grand theft. Given the serious nature of this crime, and that the necessity of making an example of other youth within our community, I hereby sentence you to 2 years of juvenile detention. The courtroom erupted into chaos, relevant, ghastly utters and murmurings. Mrs. Wilson lunged forward, her voice hoarse from anger. This can't be. Can't be. I told you he was with me. A friend tapped her, urging her to quiet down. Marcus stood in stunned silence, his brain racing to grasp what had just occurred. 2 years for a crime he didn't commit. He felt his mother grasp him tightly as she started to sob softly. His dreams of early college entrance, his scholarship, his applications, his plans for the future, everything was crumbling right before his eyes. Mr. Rodriguez immediately began arguing for an appeal, but Judge Harrison was already standing up, gathering his robes around him. This court is adjourned, he announced, running down his gavel with a sharp crack that seemed to echo Marcus' shattering future. As the bailiff approached to take Marcus into custody, he caught a glimpse of someone else in the courtroom, a young woman, about 19 or 20, with features similar to Judge Harrison's, watching the scene with a disturbed expression unknown to Marcus at that moment. This was Emma Harrison, the judge's daughter, and this day would change her life as much as it was changing his. Marcus took one last look at his mother, trying to memorize her face, knowing he wouldn't see her outside of visiting hours for the next 2 years. I love you, Mom, he whispered as the bailiff gently but firmly led him away. Sarah Johnson stood there, tears streaming down her face, watching her innocent sunbeam taken away while Judge Harrison disappeared through his chamber doors, had been utterly unfazed by the lives he had just ruined. Sarah Johnson hadn't slept properly in weeks. Her dining room table, once used for family meals with Marcus, was now filled with stacks of legal documents, newspaper clippings, and court records. Plastic cups of cold coffee adorned the edges of the table as she worked through another late night. Her reading glasses sat low on her nose while she studied yet another case file. It had been 2 months since her son had been wrongfully imprisoned. Every Wednesday and Sunday, she drove 45 minutes to visit Marcus at the Juvenile Detention Center, helplessly watching as her once vivant son grew quieter and more withdrawn. But Sarah was far from defeated. She was angry, and she was getting organized. "This isn't just about Marcus anymore," she told her sister Tracy, who came by every evening to help sort through documents. "Judge Harrison has been doing this for years." Sarah picked up a yellow legal pad filled with notes. She had begun documenting every case Judge Harrison had presided over in the past decade, and the pattern was disturbing. During the day, Sarah taught statistics at the community college. Now those skills were proving invaluable. She made spreadsheets showing how Judge Harrison gave black defendants sentences that on average were 65% longer than white defendants for the same crimes. The numbers were jolting, but numbers alone wouldn't be enough. One rainy Tuesday, while grading papers in her office, Sarah got an unexpected visitor. Mrs. Wilson, the librarian who testified for Marcus, hooped and carrying a thick manila envelope. "I've done some dating myself," Mrs. Wilson said, pulling out several old newspaper clippings. 10 years ago, Judge Harrison let a white teenager walk free in a shoplifting case with just community service. The evidence against him was solid, but his father played golf with the judge. She spread more articles across Sarah's desk and hair-raced 3 more similar cases. Sarah's hands shook as she read through the articles. "This could help prove the pattern of bias," she said, hastening to include the new information in her growing file. With the word out about Sarah's investigation, more stories began to surface. A local civil rights attorney, James Martinez, reached out after hearing of her research. "What you've uncovered is big," Martinez told her during their first meeting in his small office, "that we need to be strategic about how we use this information. Judge Harrison has powerful friends in this town." Sarah nodded, pulling out her carefully organized folders. "I've documented everything: statistics, case histories, witness statements. I even found patterns in how he speaks with different defendants based on their race." She paused, catching her breath. "My son's sitting in juvenile detention, and the real thief is probably still out there. Nobody gives a damn." Martinez flipped through pages, his face becoming more serious with each one. "This is thorough work, Mrs. Johnson. If I may, I'd like to take this to the attention of the State Judicial Review Board. I've also got contacts at the Equal Justice Initiative." While Sarah constructed her case, she continued to make her weekly visits to see Marcus. With each visit, it was like a little more of her heart broke. Her son, once ambitious about being a doctor, was now in a gray juvenile detention uniform, speaking in hushed tones of how he survived day to day. She made sure his spirits, however, were high as she spoke to him of her progress and the community's growing support. "People are starting to notice, baby," she had told them during one visit. "Mrs. Wilson has been great, and now we have a good lawyer. We're going to fix this." Late one evening, as Sarah was getting ready for bed, in came a call to her phone from an anonymous caller who identified himself as working in the courthouse. "Check Judge Harrison's records from 2015, he said in a rush. "There was a Kazi buried similar to your son's. The files are in the basement archive." Sarah didn't sleep that night. Early the next morning, she called into work, declaring her sickness, and made her way to the courthouse. With the help of a sympathetic clerk, she found the records. What she found made her hands shake. Another case of a young black student, another questionable verdict, another life derailed. As she driving home that night, Sarah felt a black SUV following her. 3 unnecessary turns later, it was an unmistakable message. Her investigation was making powerful people nervous. But Sarah Johnson wasn't about to back down. She pulled into her driveway, gathered her files, and trod on into the house with her head held high. "They think they can scare me," she muttered to herself, placing the fresh case files in her folder. But they don't know what it means to mess with a mother fighting for her child. Emma Harrison sat in the poorly lighted law school library, her hands shaking as she stared at her laptop screen. What had started as a simple research project for her criminal justice class, it had turned into a life-changing discovery. She had chosen to analyze her father's sentencing patterns for her term paper, expecting to find evidence of his judicial wisdom. Instead, she had found something which made her stomach turn. "This can't be right," she whispered to herself, double-checking the numbers for the fifth time. The statistics were unambiguous. In cases involving black defendants under age 25, her father's sentences were always harsher. The Marcus Johnson case from 3 months ago wasn't an exception. It was part of a pattern. The elegant Harrison family home felt different that evening as Emma walked through the front door. Family photos lined the hallway. Her father in his judge's robes, family vacations, her law school acceptance celebration. Everything she once saw with pride now seemed tainted. Judge William Harrison sat in his usual leather chair, reading glasses perched on his nose as he reviewed case files. "There's my future lawyer," he called out cheerfully. "How's the term paper coming along?" Emma stood in the doorway, clutching her laptop. "Dad, we need to talk about your cases." Her father's smile faltered slightly. "Oh, what about them? I've been analyzing your sentencing records," Emma said, her voice quivering. "The Marcus Johnson case made me curious, so I dug deeper." She opened her laptop and turned it toward him. "How do you explain this?" Judge Harrison's face hardened as he looked at the spreadsheet. "You're too young to understand the complexities of criminal justice." Emma's statistics can be manipulated to show anything. "I'm not manipulating anything." Emma's voice rose. "These are your own records. Marcus Johnson had solid proof he was innocent, but you sent him to juvenile detention anyway. And he's not the only one." Her mother, Patricia Harrison, appeared in the doorway, attracted by the raised voices. "What's going on here?" "Our daughter seems to think she knows more about justice than a judge with 30 years of experience," Judge Harrison said, coldly closing Emma's laptop. "Dad, Marcus Johnson was working at the library when that theft happened. There were witnesses, security footage, everything. How could you ignore all that evidence?" Emma felt tears forming in her eyes. Emma Marie Harrison, her father, stood up, his full height, imposing. "You will not question my judicial decisions in my own house. I've spent my career protecting this community from criminals or from people who look different from us." Emma shot back. "Because that's what the numbers show, Dad. That's what your own records show." Patricia tried to intervene. "Emma, honey, your father has always been fair." "No, Mom, he hasn't." Emma pulled out more papers from her bag. "Look at these cases. White defendants getting probation for the same crimes that send black defendants to jail. It's all here." Judge Harrison's face turned red. "That's enough. You're just a first-year law student. You don't understand the nuances of each case, the factors that go into these decisions." "What factors?" Emma demanded. "Their skin color, because that seems to be the biggest factor in your courtroom." The sound of Judge Harrison's hand slapping on his desk reverberated around the room. "I will not be accused of racism in my own home, not by my own daughter." Emma stood her ground, though her entire body shaking. "Then explain, Marcus Johnson, explain why you disregarded all the evidence. Explain why a 16-year-old honor student is behind bars in juvenile detention for a crime he could not have committed." Her father turned away, looking out the window. "Go to your room, Emma. We're done here." "No, Dad, we're not done." Emma got her things. "I'm leaving. I can't stay here tonight. I can't pretend this is okay anymore." "Emma, please," her mother pleaded. "Don't leave like this." But Emma was already heading for the door as she reached for her car. As she heard her father's voice, colder than she'd ever heard it. "If you walk out that door, don't expect any more support for law school." Emma paused, her hand on the doorknob. Years of love and respect for her father fought against what she knew was right. Then she thought of Marcus Johnson sitting in a cell for something he didn't do and made her choice. "Keep your money," she said in a quiet tone. "I'd rather struggle to pay for school than act like I don't see what you're doing." She opened the door and walked out into the night, leaving behind a silence heavier than anything the Harrison home had ever known. The office of the local Millbrook Gazette buzzed with unusual energy this Wednesday morning. Reporter Michael Chun stared at his screen, rereading the email that had come in anonymously the night before. Attachments include court records, statistical analysis, and some pretty disturbing pattern of judicial bias in Judge Harrison's courtroom. "Chief, you need to see this," Michael called to his editor, Linda Peters. He had spent the entire night verifying the information. "Remember that convenience store theft case, the one with the teenager Marcus Johnson? It goes way deeper than we thought." Linda leaned over his shoulder, her eyes whitening as she scrolled through the documents. "Are these numbers verified?" Triple-check them myself, Michael replied, and there's more. The convenience store owner finally agreed to talk 2 hours later. Michael was sitting across from Mr. Thompson, the owner of Wilson's convenience store, in a quiet little coffee shop. The elderly man toyed with his coffee cup, looking nervous. "I found the original security footage," Mr. Thompson said quietly, sliding a USB drive across the table. "The police only got the grainy copy, but this is the clear version from my backup system." I was scared to come forward before. At the office, Michael and Linda watched the crystal clear footage. It showed someone completely different from Marcus Johnson. Committing the theft, a shorter, lighter-skinned person wearing a distinctive red baseball cap. Wait, Linda pointed at the screen. Freeze that frame. She squinted at the image. That looks like Tommy Phillips. Isn't his father on the city council? The investigation. Snowball. More people started coming forward. Mrs. Chun, from the dry cleaners across from Wilson's convenience store, had seen Tommy Phillips running from the store that day, she had told the police. But her statement never made it into the official report. Meanwhile, Sarah Johnson's careful record of Judge Harrison's cases had made its way to the State Judicial Review Board. The board was unable to turn a blind eye to the mountain of evidence. Hundreds of cases demonstrating a remarkably consistent pattern of discriminatory sentencing. The local TV stations took notice of the story, Injustice in Black and White. A judge's controversial record headlined news programs across the state. Outside the courthouse, protesters congregated, holding free Marcus Johnson and equal justice for all signs. Emma Harrison watched the newscasts. Her small apartment, where she had been staying since leaving home, her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "Your father is furious. The whole town is talking about this." But Emma wasn't thinking about her father's reputation. She was thinking about Marcus Johnson, still sitting in juvenile detention despite mounting evidence of his innocence. She made a decision and dialed Michael Chen's number. "I have more information," she said when he answered, "about my father's cases, and am willing to go on record." But this morning's Gazette had a doozy of a headline. "Judge's daughter speaks out, pattern of bias can't be ignored." Emma's courageous testimony, along with the statistical evidence and new security footage, created a storm of perfect timing. The DA's office could no longer look the other way. They officially opened an investigation into Marcus' case and several dozen others that took place under Judge Harrison in juvenile detention. Marcus sat in the common room, staring at himself on the news. A few other inmates had gathered. It was about patting him on his back. His mother had visited the day before, telling him to be strong. The truth was finally coming out. The result was that Tommy Phillips was getting pressure from every corner and finally confessed. He came clean about the theft, saying he had a drug problem and needed money. His father's influence had kept him out of trouble until now. Judge Harris Chambers, once the place of unquestioned authority, became eerily quiet. His secretary began to notice him spending hours staring at old case files. Especially in the case of Marcus Johnson, the judge had always thought he meted out justice. But now, with irrefutable proof of his prejudicial thinking, some fissures appeared in his stern mask. The story went national. Civil rights organizations issued statements, and legal experts began reviewing similar trends in other jurisdictions. What had begun as one mother's battle for her son had turned into a broader debate about justice and racial prejudice within the legal system. Sarah Johnson was standing in her living room, observing this coverage, reaching to touch the empty frame where Marcus' graduation photo should have been. "Hold on just a little longer, baby," she whispered. The truth was finally coming out. Emma Harrison sat in the waiting room of the State Judicial Review Board building, her heart pounding against her ribs. The manila folder in her lap contained documents that could end her father's career and her relationship with her family forever. Her testimony was scheduled for 10 a.m., and the clock on the wall said 9:45. Her phone buzzed again, another message from Mom. "Please don't do this to your dad. We can work this out." As a family, Emma powered off her phone, thinking of Marcus Johnson's mom, sobbing in the courtroom. 3 months earlier, Miss Harrison, a navy blue-suited woman, appeared at the door. "Vard is ready to see you." The hearing room was much smaller than Emma had envisioned, nothing like her father's grand courtroom. 5 board members sat behind a lengthy table, their faces somber as they examined their papers. A court reporter sat in corner, her fingers hovering over her stenotype machine. "Please state your name for the record." The chairwoman's voice was soft, yet firm. "Emma Marie Harrison, daughter of Judge William Harrison." Emma's voice quivered, but she willed herself to continue. I'm a first law student at State University. Miss Harrison, we understand this must be difficult for you. Please, take your time. Emma opened her folder and pulled out her research. I found the pattern when I was doing some research for a school project. At first, I didn't want to believe it. She passed copies of her analysis to the board members. Over the past 10 years, my father has sentenced black defendants to terms averaging 65% longer than white defendants for the same crimes. The room was silent except for the clicking of the court reporter's machine. In the case of Marcus Johnson, Emma continued, her voice growing stronger. My father ignored substantial evidence of innocence. Security footage, multiple witnesses, and a solid alibi were all dismissed without proper consideration. The hearing room door burst open, and in walked her father, flanked by his attorney. Judge Harrison was ashen-faced as he sat down at the back of the room, and Emma's hands were shaking, but she carried on. I found similar patterns in dozens of cases, including the Thompson case in 2018, the Rivera case in 2016, the Washington case in 2015. She listed case after case. Injustice piled upon injustice, knowing her father was staring directly into the back of her skull, burning a hole. The real suspect thief in the Johnson case is now confessed, she finally added. Still, Marcus Johnson remains in juvenile detention. Because my father refuses to acknowledge mistake for the next 2 hours, Emma answered the board's questions, explaining her research methodology, providing specific examples, and sharing personal observations of her father's behavior on the bench. She could hear her father shifting in his seat, behind her clearing his throat occasionally. As the hearing neared its end, the chairman asked one final question. Miss Harrison, what motivated you to come forward? Emma finally turned to look at her father. Their eyes met across the room. I was raised to believe in justice, she said, her voice clear and steady. My father taught me that. He used to tell me that doing the right thing isn't always easy, but it's always necessary. Today I'm living by those words, even if he no longer does. Judge Harrison's face crumpled for a moment before he quickly composed himself. His attorney whispered something in his ear, but he shook his head slightly, his eyes never leaving his daughter. Outside the hearing room, reporters waited with cameras and microphones. Emma slipped out through a side door, but not before hearing the board's chairwoman announce that a full investigation would be launched into all of Judge Harrison's cases from the past decade. In the parking lot, Emma found Sarah Johnson waiting by her car. They had never spoken before, but Sarah had reached out after reading Emma's newspaper interview. Thank you, Sarah said, simply, her eyes filled with tears. What? You get in there. Not everyone would be strong enough. Emma felt her own tears finally start to fall. I kept thinking about Marcus, about all of them. Someone had to speak up. Sarah hugged her tightly. You're not alone in this. You did the right thing. As Emma drove home to her small apartment, she passed her childhood house. The porch light was on. Her mother always kept it on for her. But tonight, like every night since she decided to testify, she drove past without stopping. Some choices change everything, and there's no going back. The day Marcus Johnson walked out of juvenile detention, the sky was a brilliant blue. He squinted in the bright sunlight, still wearing his detention center uniform, because the clothes he came in with no longer fit. 3 months of confinement had changed him. He was thinner, quieter, his eyes carrying a weight that hadn't been there before. Sarah Johnson waited by her car, trying to hold back tears as she watched her son walk to her. Standing behind her was Mr. Rodriguez, their lawyer, clutching a folder containing Marcus' release paper and the official apology from the court. Baby, Sarah whispered, wrapping her arms around Marcus. He felt smaller, more fragile than she remembered. Let's go home. The drive home was quiet. Marcus stared out the window, watching as familiar streets passed by. They had missed his 17th birthday last week. The party would come later. Right now, he needed time to get it all registered. Across town, Judge William Harrison sat alone in his chamber with the letter of suspension in front of him on the desk. The State Judicial Review Board's investigation had been swift and ruthless. More than 400 of his cases had been examined or reviewed, finding clear evidence of racial bias in his sentencing patterns. His line rang. Another reporter seeking comment. You let it go to voicemail. Just like the dozens of other calls, the local newspaper's headline that morning read Judge Harrison suspended pending full investigation of discriminatory sentencing. A knock on his door made him look up. It was Patricia, his wife, carrying a small box. They want you to clear out your office by tomorrow. she said softly. Emma called. She wanted to know if you're okay, Judge Harrison's hands trembled as he picked up a framed photo from his desk. Emma's law school acceptance celebration. I didn't see it, he whispered, or maybe I didn't want to see it all these years. The Johnson house at home. Marcus sat on his bed, touching his stuff as if reassuring himself that it was real. His basketball trophies, his science fair medals, his college application essays, everything was precisely the way he left it. But he wasn't the same person who had left this room 3 months ago. Marcus. His mother called from downstairs. Someone's here to see you. He walked downstairs to find Emma Harrison standing in their living room. Marcus recognized her from the courtroom. Yet she looked different now, rougher around the edges, more human. I wanted to apologize, Emma said as her voice began to break. What my father did to you. I'm so sorry. Marcus examined her face. You risked everything to speak the truth. You don't have anything to be sorry about. The State Judicial Review Board wasn't through. They made sensitivity training for all judges in the district mandatory. All of Judge Harrison's cases from the last 10 years would be reviewed by an independent panel. Some sentences would be withdrawn or given a reduced sentence. Entirely, that evening, Judge Harris sat in his study at home, watching the local news coverage of Marcus released. The reporter interviewed Marcus briefly as he left the detention center. What are your plans now? The reporter had asked him. Going to finish high school, Marcus had replied. Then law school. Someone needs to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. The judge turned off the TV, his hand shaking as he reached for his phone. He scrolled to Emma's number, hesitated, then typed, "You are right, I was wrong. I'm sorry." 3 minutes later, his phone buzzed with her response. "It's not me you need to apologize to." In his room, Marcus opened his laptop for the first time since his release. Hundreds of messages waited from classmates, teachers, and strangers who had followed his story. One message caught his eye from a local civil rights organization offering him an internship. Sarah watched her son from the doorway, saw him smile for the first time since his release. The fight wasn't over. There were still hundreds of cases to review, lives to rebuild, and ask system to reform. But tonight, her son was back home across town. Judge Harrison stood in his empty chambers one last time. He picked up the last photo from his desk. Himself in his judge's robes on the day he was appointed. He had been so proud then, so certain of his righteousness. That certainty was gone now, replaced by the heavy weight of recognition. As he turned out the lights, he finally understood that true justice required more than just following the law. It required looking into one's own heart and acknowledging the prejudices that lived there. 5 years moved quickly. Marcus Johnson smoothed his tie, padding down the hallways of State University's law school at 22, carrying an air of quieted confidence. His detention center ID card, tucked away in his wallet, was a constant reminder of how far he had come. The lecture hall was full by the time he reached the podium. Now a third-year law student had been invited to speak about juvenile justice reform. Among the audience, he saw his mom, Sarah, now running a nonprofit organization which helped families affected by judicial bias. My story begins with an injustice. Marcus spoke early and lucidly, but that's not all. He told the following: how he had seen his students furiously take notes. Some of them had studied his case in their criminal justice classes across the state. At the Carter Law School, Emma Harr was causing waves as well. Her thesis about racial bias and judicial decision-making had gleaned the interest of the Innocence Project. Today, she sat at their office reviewing cases like Marcus. We found 15 more cases from your father's court that need immediate review, her supervisor said, laying a pile of case files on her desk. Emma nodded, pulled the first one towards her. Her father's signature was on the bottom of each sentencing document, a reminder why she chose this path. Later that afternoon, Marcus got an email out of the blue. The State Bar Association wanted him to head a youth mentorship program for up-and-coming lawyers from disadvantaged backgrounds. As he read the email, his phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from Emma. Turn Channel 4 on now. The news was on much older. Humble speaking at a judicial reform conference. It was his first public appearance since completing his sensitivity training and counseling program. My own prejudices blinded me to true justice, Judge Harrison acknowledged to the audience. It took losing everything, my position, my reputation, and most importantly, my daughter's respect to see the truth. Marcus watched the screen, remembering the man who had sentenced him without a second thought. The judge looked different now. his arrogance replaced by what appeared to be genuine regret. That night, Emma sat in her modest apartment surrounded by case files. Her father's words at the conference played within her laptop. Tears ran down her cheeks while she listened to him publicly admit mistakes. For the first time, her phone rang. It was Marcus. "I saw your father's speech." "He said me too," Emma replied. "Do you think people can really change?" "I have to believe they can," Marcus answered. "Otherwise, what are we fighting for?" The following morning, Marcus visited his old juvenile detention center. Now, as a legal advocate, he walked through the same halls he had once been imprisoned, talking with young inmates, sharing his story, offering hope. In one cell, he came across a 16-year-old boy who reminded him of himself. This boy had been sentenced by another hanging judge, known to give unduly harsh sentencing to minority youth. Marcus pulled out his notepad just as Emma had taught him, document everything. Meanwhile, Emma had her struggles at the Innocence Project. Colleagues questioned her commitment. One asked her if she was trying to atone for her father's sins. But with each case she helped overturn, she proved herself. Over lunch, she got a surprise call from her mom. "Your father's been asked to speak at schools about bias in the justice system," Patricia said. He wanted to know if he'd help him prepare his talks. Emma sat silent for a moment. "Tell them we'll think about it." Later that afternoon, Marcus and Emma met up at the usual coffee shop. An improbable friendship had emerged between them, sealed by their mutual dedication to justice reform. Both were following lines of work life that put them at variance with the expectations of their families. Marcus could have pursued a safer career. Emma could have joined a prestigious law firm. "I got the grant," Marcus announced, sliding the approval letter across the table. "The funding would help establish a legal clinic for juvenile defendants." Emma smiled. "We're really doing this, aren't we? Making changes in the system one case at a time." Marcus nodded. "It's not fast enough, but it's happening." As they discussed their plans, neither could have imagined this partnership 5 years ago. The wrongly convicted teenager and the judge's daughter working together to fix their paths to redemption were about creating the justice system that they had wished had existed when Marcus first stood in Judge Harrison's courtroom. The state judicial reform conference was abuzz with excitement. The main hall was packed with judges, lawyers, and activists from across the country. On stage, two names appeared on the digital screen: keynote speakers Marcus Johnson and Emma Harrison, building a new path to justice. A graduating law student and youth advocate, Marcus struggled to contain his emotions as he felt his heart pounding in his chest. Justice advocate adjusted his microphone. At 22, he carried himself with the quiet strength of someone who had turned pain into purpose. Emma stood beside him, her work with the Innocence Project having helped free 12 wrongfully convicted juveniles in the past. Last year, in the front row, sat Sarah Johnson proudly, holding hands with Mrs. Wilson, the librarian who had never stopped supporting them. Behind them sat Patricia at Harrison, and to everyone's surprise, Judge William Harrison himself, looking older and humbler in a simple gray suit. 5 years ago, I stood in a courtroom watching my future disappear because of one man's bias. His eyes met Judge Harrison's briefly, but today I'm not here to talk about that injustice. I'm here to talk about change. Emma stepped forward. When I first discovered my father's bias sentencing patterns, I thought exposing the truth would be enough. But we've learned true change requires more than just revealing injustice. It requires rebuilding the entire system. They unveiled their new initiative, the Second Chance Youth Justice Program. The program would provide legal support, education opportunities, and mentorship for juveniles in the justice system, with a particular emphasis on eradicating systemic bias. Seated, Judge Harrison listened while his daughter and Marcus gave examples of cases representative of those he had presided over. Each story landed like a physical blow, yet he made himself stay and bear witness. Our program has already received the support of 30 judges who have committed to looking at their own biases, Marcus announced. And today we're adding another name to that list. The audience whispered as Judge Harrison slowly rose to his feet. You walked towards the stage, with every step weighing a mountain of his past actions. Marcus and Emma moved aside, giving him way to the microphone. "I am William Harrison," he said. His voice trembled a little. "Some of you know me as a judge who sent an innocent teenager to juvenile detention. Others know me as a father whose daughter took a stand against injustice." He stopped for a second, gathering himself together. "Today, I stand before you, not as a judge, but as a man, asking for the chance to help repair what I helped break." Sarah Johnson watched as her son stepped forward and shook hands with his offender. The gesture wasn't forgiveness. It was something more powerful, acknowledgement that change was possible. After the conference, they convened in a small meeting room. Judge Harrison confronted Marcus for the first time since sentencing. "I've spent 5 years in counseling, learning about my biases," the judge said quietly, "but nothing taught me more than watching you turn my injustice into something positive." Marcus nodded. "The system didn't break me, Judge Harrison. Instead, it showed me what needed to be fixed." Emma embraced her father for the first time in many years. Patricia wiped away tears as she saw her family slowly start to heal. The next day, local newspapers carried the story. Former judge teams up with man he wrongly convicted. But the real story wasn't in the headlines. It was in the small details. It was in the way Marcus now mentored young people in trouble with the law. It was in how this was Emma's calling, helping others in their search for justice. It was in the way Judge Harrison now spoke at schools about recognizing and confronting personal bias. As they left the conference center, Marcus and Emma married, their families no longer separate units bound by an injustice, but partners in creating change. "You know," Marcus said, looking at the sunset, "when I was in detention, I never imagined this ending." Emma smiled. "Maybe it's not an ending. Maybe it's just the beginning." Sarah Johnson took one last photo of her son and Emma standing with their new youth justice program banner, Judge Harrison in the background, all of them focused on the future rather than the past, the story of a racist judge and an innocent black youth that transformed into something larger, a testament to the possibility of change, the power of truth, and the long, hard road to justice. As they walked away together, they carried with them the knowledge that although the past was never going to be changed, their future was yet to be decided.